You're listening to the Sledgehammer Podcast with me, Paul Ebbs. This week we're going to be talking about the Ark in space with John, he never snitches up, Dorney. But first, a little bit of history. Back in 2017, I undertook to watch all of televised Doctor Who in one calendar year because I'm insane and have no life. I would start on January the 1st with An Unearthly Child and sledgehammer my way through, come hell, high water, or removal to the nearest psychiatric facility to December the 25th, finishing on Twice Upon a Time. What started out as the Doctor Who fans' equivalent of the Hajj rapidly turned into a project to try to understand how Doctor Who was written and is still being written. I would watch an episode, then immediately record my impressions on how it was constructed and plotted in what became the mammoth 350,000-word Sledgehammer Diary. With Doctor Who, often it's the facts and figures, the minutiae, the actors, producers and the special effects wizards who are lauded and picked over. But I've seen very few examples of Doctor Who stories being considered as pieces of writing. This podcast, I hope, will do that. Each week I'll have a conversation with someone who has written or still writes Doctor Who stories. I'll talk to them about why they think a particular story is worth exploring from a writing perspective and how they themselves go about writing their own Doctor Who fiction. Hopefully, at the end of each episode we'll have taken the bonnet off and had a good rummage around in the engines of the best Doctor Who stories and given you not only the encouragement to consider these stories afresh, but maybe some insights and inspiration to write your own. The Ark in Space was written by Robert Holmes from an uncredited idea and script by John Lucarotti, produced by Philip Hinchcliffe, directed by Rodney Bennett, and transmitted between January and February 1975. It's a story that counts as one of the most terrifying in Doctor Who history, with its full-on body horror styling and horrific themes. But it's also a fantastic piece of speculative fiction, and is a line drawn in the sand at the start of Tom Baker's era, immediately after the cosy and familiar robot, that Doctor Who has been taken to another level by Robert Holmes, a writer with a singular vision and focus. Award-winning John Dorney is an actor and a writer who is one of the mainstays of the Big Finish range of Doctor Who audio plays and their attendant spin-offs. For these streams he has written, about 12t16 stories which never disappoint as pieces of audio drama. In fact, for my money, his Doom Coalition 3 story for the 8th Doctor, Absent Friends, is the finest Doctor Who story released by the company, and it's one I always point people towards as a leaping on point, because it's just so darn good. I've been lucky in this series to talk to scribblers who I like as people, but also admire as writers, so it's terrific that John took time out to chat with me this week. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
Not too bad at all, not too bad at all. I've got my cup of tea, which basically is all I need. Ready and raring to go.
Excellent. So, as is traditional so far in these things that I have been recording, I think this is the 5th one I've done now. I'd like you to, for the people listening at home who might not be experts in John Dorney, for you to tell us just a little bit.
So few people are, I find.
Tell us a bit about you, basically your writing life, your writing career. So give us a thumbnail.
Well, my name's, as you say, John Dorney. I'm a writer, sometimes actor, sometimes script editor. I've been kind of writing as long as I remember, really. I was always doing it when I was at school, and even my first brush with the business was as an actor, going to drama school, and somehow within even weeks there, I was sort of pigeonholed as the guy who would write stuff. So ended up writing scripts for other people to do their fight exams, because you needed to have scripts around that and sketches and things like that. And that led to when I'd finished drama school and I was unemployed, or as I put it at the time, on my government playwriting grant, I decided to try and write a play. And I ended up writing a play. Third one I had a go at was reasonably okay, got into the Royal Court Young Writers Festival. which sort of is where it all began, really. I mean, I say that. I think after doing that and then writing another play, I then basically did nothing for the best part of a decade, largely just by not really feeling I had anything to say or knowing what I wanted to say. I was still quite young. And then I was just drifting slowly back into other things. I started writing sketches for some Radio 4 shows, one called Recorded for Training Purposes, which is great fun. I did about 3 seasons of that. And that really made me fall in love with audio. And from there, that helped me get into doing sort of the Doctor Who audios for Big Finish. And in fact, the first one I did was Sapphire Steel. And so that is where people might know me from, is from writing a lot of the Big Finish stuff. In fact, yeah, I think I'm up to about a little over 100 plays now. A little over 100. It's really hard to count because a lot of them are adaptations, and there are other ones where it's like 2 disc stories, but each disc has a different title. So is that 2 stories or is that 1 story? I don't know. What's the difference? I can't tell. So, yeah, I think it's around about 100. Certainly is probably about 100 now because I'm definitely over the point where I thought I got 100. So, yeah, that's my background.
So one of the reasons that obviously I wanted to get you here to talk on Sledgehammer is because you've written probably more Doctor Who than almost anybody else in terms of professional. You know, maybe Nick Briggs and Matt Fitton, I don't know if they've written more than you.
They're just ahead of me, I think, yeah.
But you're the guy. You're one of Big Finish's go-to guys. Doctor Who, just to have a quick turn around Doctor Who is now, the audio has overtaken the TV a long time ago. There are more audio Doctor Who stories. So what is Doctor Who now? Is it just a multi-faceted, totally non-medium specific entity?
Well, that's an interesting question. Oddly enough, I was debating this at the weekend on Twitter, which is obviously not the best way of doing these things. And about because I've long since, and I know there's a lot of people who kind of go, there is no such thing as canon. I don't believe that. I believe, being honest, that the TV series canon and nothing else is canon as such. But that's because I once ages ago read this description of canon as being that which is generally regarded to be true.
Yeah.
And the moment I kind of went with that as my definition, suddenly it took a personal taste out of the matter. Because people will often say, oh, that's not canon, when they just mean, well, I don't like that.
Yes.
I think, so ultimately, I think everything doffs their cap to the TV series. And I think generally speaking, everyone buys that as the central thing. But beyond that point, what people talk about personal canon, which I think is an oxymoron, they mean personal continuity. And everybody's personal continuity can be whatever the hell they want.
Yes.
That's, for me, this is the point where I go, I think there's a degree to which everything else has to be kind of, for want of a better term, canonical in terms of fitting in with what I think of as the canon. So ideally, I'd like to fit in with the TV show. Yeah. But at the same time, anything that doesn't work, you just go, oh, the Time War then. I don't know. Time War's effects, filtering back and forward. Yeah, does it matter? Yeah, it's Time War.
Just before we get into the arc in space, which is obviously something we're about to talk about today, and I'm really looking forward to that. When you, and this is probably a question for later, so I'll probably drop it in later, but it just occurred to me now. Yeah. When you write a Doctor Who story, are you writing, do you feel, something that is just a TV story without the pictures, or do you like to use the medium? Now, in terms of Absent Friends, there's a brilliant device in there that you use, the telephone calls, which is a brilliant audio trick. Device, that's the word I was looking for. But where are you? Are you just writing Doctor Who stories? Are you writing Doctor Who stories that are just television without the pictures?
I think you've got to look at the medium specifically. I think it's why anytime anyone says these things about, oh, wouldn't it be great if they animated Big Finish stories, I kind of find myself going, I think it would lose something. And it's not necessarily as obvious as some of the tricks. I think anytime anyone says, oh, this story's amazing, it could only work on audio. A lot of the time I find myself going, well, one, no, you could probably find a way of telling that particular story. It's just the way the story has been told, which is specific to the medium rather than the story itself. But often people will notice it when it's little tricks and gimmicks. And so, and I use them occasionally. Something like mine, like say the Rocket Men. Really is just kind of uses a few kind of, we're aware of what you're doing and using that. But most of the time, it's probably a little bit more hidden and a little bit subtler than that in theory. It's a slightly weird thing to say because I suppose I don't ever really think of them visually. That's probably the key aspect for me. I don't ever go in thinking about, well, this would be a cool visual. I think this would be a cool moment. This is an exciting plot point. But I never think in terms of cool visuals, which always makes me feel slightly guilty when cover designers have to come up with pictures to put on the front of the CDs, because the majority of the time I've given them nothing. And that's every now and then there's things like, I don't know, there's one I've got called The High Price of Parking, where they basically had to put these sort of rather small part robots on the cover just for the sake of having something to include on the cover. And that's, it's beautifully done. It's amazing design. But I can slightly sense that bit of people going, oh yeah. I mean, and I've got one coming out, this 10th Doctor one, the first, the Dalek Universe one, where I kind of had this joke with going, oh yeah, technically it has a massive spoiler on the cover because that's the story featuring the Vizians. It's got a Vizian right there. So you go, yeah, good luck with that. Go. And again, that's why we go, good luck to the cover designer. What's the main monster in this episode? Oh, they're invisible. Thanks. I tend to think from conceptual stage.
Yeah.
As I say, it's not even like actively thinking about making it audio. It's just not thinking in visual terms. I think is probably my way in.
Brilliant. That's great. So let's get into the first half of the podcast now. You chose The Ark in Space to talk about from a writing perspective, and obviously it's a great story. So give me the headlines, John. What's your thinking about the writing of Ark in Space?
Well, I think it's broadly speaking remarkable. The reason I wanted to talk about it specifically was that I'm a script editor as well as a writer. So that's one aspect that I don't think gets talked about particularly that much. But specifically in terms of what I thought about with Ark in Space, I think often people have this idea, certainly of scriptwriters, that I think the phrase I've used is like a perfect crucible, where you can make your story. You basically go, right, I can just throw in this, and just make a story. And that's not the way it works, particularly with drama, an acted drama. It may be so with books. I haven't done enough books to do, but I imagine even then you've got like a reasonable word count to be aiming for, and what sort of the amount of pages you can actually do and make it a profitable thing for people to buy. All of those sort of things feed in. And what I think people don't bear in mind in terms of script writing is the technical stuff. And that's technical stuff like how many actors you've got, and how, in terms of TV scripting, how many sets you've got, how much time it would take to film, all of those practical things that have to fit in and play against each other in the making of a script. And so in terms of the actual scripting and writing of The Ark in Space, when you bear in mind its production history, that this is a last minute rewrite, actually like page one rewrite really, by Robert Holmes, that's also got to hit a shopping list. That's what I found remarkable about the fact that you can do something, usually from a script editing perspective, if you are trying to like go, well, this script isn't working, I need to save it. It's very tough. You can make things better. You can never make them brilliant, really. And that's possibly like Revenge of the Cybermen. Not to be massively, I haven't rewatched it in a while, but I like Revenge of the Cybermen well enough, but it's not a classic.
No.
Ark in Space is the example of Holmes just going, well, let's go do page one and just write it, and it's brilliant.
Yeah. But
when you consider the circumstances in which he's had to do that and the pressure he's been under whilst doing it, it's even more remarkable. And in so many ways, I think, because obviously it's got to be on the same sets. It's got to have all of those sort of things. And he's just basically had to come up with it out of nowhere, pretty much.
I think, yes, I agree with all of that. And it is a remarkable story. And it draws, in my review of it for my Sledgehammer thing, I say it draws a line in the sand. Everything after Ark in Space is lifted. I love the John Pertwee era, and I love Giant Robot. Yeah. Uncle Terry is a hero of mine. But Ark in Space, it's it's a paradigm shift. It's more adult, it's more horrific, it's more everything, which is really cool when you consider, and I don't know what you feel about this, is I love episodes 2, 3 and 4. Episode 1 is a fantastic bottle episode, but it's not really necessary. And I think you all know this, 6-episode stories often need a dog leg to go somewhere. Seeds of Doom spends 2 episodes in the Antarctic. Time Warrior goes to Atlantis. Ark in Space feels like we're setting up for a 6-episode one because we've just got this 3-hander in Minerva Beacon, and it's a character piece. And we get Holmes's brilliant, indomitable spirit speech. Yeah. But it's not really other than showing us where the story's about to take place. But it is just 25 minutes of the Doctor, Harry and Sarah. Do you think that works in the story? I mean, I love the story. I'm not knocking it. Do you think that works in the story's favour? Or would you have rather had like 10 minutes of that and then more Ark in Space.
Well, one of the things I think I like with the Ark in Space is it's very succinct. It's very terse. It's about as straightforward as a Doctor Who story gets. It's basically a survival thriller.
Yeah.
From about halfway through episode 2, it's just, we're in trouble. How do we get out of this one? And how do we get out of this one? How do we get out of this one over and over and over again? And when it starts, it goes like a rocket. And there isn't room for much other than story at that point. So I quite like episode 1. I found it really interesting because I, as you know, because I sent over a copy, I managed to track down the original Lucarotti draft, which starts much more quickly. It is pretty much what you say. It's about maybe 10 minutes of the Doctor faffing around. He knows where he is already. Yeah. He knows about Noah's Ark and what it is, and he's popped in every now and then for centuries.
Yeah.
And Noah and everyone else is revived before the end of episode 1, and you even meet the alien menace at the end of episode 1. And it just seems a bit rushed to me. I like I think in a 4-parter, I like the opening episode to be exploration. I think it feels exploring what the world is, taking a bit of time usually and exploring the boundaries. And it feels to me that knowing where you are to start with immediately removes something. Mm-hmm. The Doctor doesn't have to find out where he is and what's going on. I mean, obviously that doesn't work if it's necessarily in history or things like that. But there is always an element of exploration and figuring it out. And it's a little contrived in the script that the Doctor basically just doesn't tell Sarah and Harry in order to get this bit of information. You go, well, just don't know where you are. Why do you need to find this out? Why do you need to know straight away? And I can sort of see why it happens. As much as I say, I think this is Holmes writing a bit of a rush. But as I say, I think always in terms of writing to the parameters, the skill is in making those technical constrictions invisible. And I think that's what episode 1 does for me. I mean, I think for me, it's a fairly remarkable episode because it also reveals something I think interesting about Holmes's process to a degree.
Yeah.
In that if you wanted to do like a filler starting episode, that's not the hardest thing in the world. What I think is intriguing with episode 1 of Ark in Space is it's pretty much entirely reverse engineered from the premise of the rest of the story.
Yes.
The entire setup of what happens to them in episode 1 goes in reverse through what happened to the Wirren. Mm-hmm. So they initially get locked in and kind of run out of oxygen, and then switching on the power, which the Wirren has cut, activates the electrical security device.
Yeah, security sentry.
Which, God knows why that's there and even on, for crying out loud. But that's an interesting bit of plan because Holmes has had to figure out this is what's happened to the Wirren.
And they'll reverse
And then
that.
if we reverse the process of going, okay, so we've got the threat that means they've got to reconnect the power. And now it activates the electrical guard. And now we've got to get the electrical guard off. That is more complicated than it needs to be.
Yes.
That is a guy who is not taking the easy option.
No.
Because you could find a way of doing the security guard could be on automatically already. Things like that.
Well, he has to find something, some business and excitement, because he's decided his constraints are that this first episode is just going to be a character episode. So something has to happen. Yeah. And I think that's a really good observation you make there, because it never occurred to me before that it's what happened to the Wirren in reverse. I think that's really smart. That makes it even smarter.
Yeah.
And your point about Holmes making it more complicated than it needs to, because it could have just been the easy finding out stuff, couldn't it?
Yeah.
But giving that action sequence with cricket balls and shoes and down behind the table and stuff. Also, the other thing that's happening with that first episode, which I suppose we could give it the credit for, is that it's giving us what the new TARDIS team looks like and interacts like in a way that we didn't get because we didn't know they were the new TARDIS team in Giant Robot. So Holmes is exploring Harry, and I think Harry gets the best of it. He gets pretty much he's such an engaging character, and we're discovering the Doctor through Harry and this new world through Harry in a way that we've spent 6 stories with Sarah finding all this out. But he really, I mean, he makes Harry a fully rounded 3-dimensional character, doesn't he?
Yeah, I've always adored Harry. Harry is, I think, one of my favourite companions from the original run, even with such a limited amount of stories that he actually turns up in. And it's a glorious sort of central performance from Ian Marter. I think, exactly what you say. I think it's clear that within this first episode, Holmes is taking the time to go, right, who is this team? It's a good moment to do that. That's the other thing. We watch so many of these stories in isolation as well, without really the context of what they're in. And so the first episode is just taking that time to go, right, let's nail this character now. When I think about it, because I've recently rewatched Robot, the main reason I was kind of had Ark in Space in my mind because I decided to like watch all of the Blu-rays in order, every special feature, all of that. So I did Robot, then I did Ark in Space. And so much about Harry is defined very quickly in this first episode. I've always felt the thing I love with Harry is it's that faint sense of this is what we'd be like.
Yes.
In theory, he's not stupid. He is, in comparison to the Doctor. He's just a little bit out of his depth and a little bit unsure of the way things are. And I think genuinely it has sort of one of my favourite moments between the two of them is, which I don't think is celebrated often enough. It's one of my favourite lines in the whole of the original series is, what did you touch, Harry? Whatever he says. He goes, me? He goes, well, there are only two of us here, and your name is Harry, which is such a great line. And immediately, that's where you're going with that character from this point. Because it's not him being stupid. It's just that kind of, what's going on? It's like, but still managing to be brave and good and decent.
I think there's a wonderful naivety about Harry, which is really engaging, which Holmes really plays up in those scenes. And he comes to the, when he realises it all comes together, when he says, well, if I had a cricket ball, I could hit that. It's just, and the Doctor just produces a cricket ball. That's just such a lovely moment. And Harry is suddenly given a chance to properly shine, which I really love. So that first episode, it's not that I don't like it. I mean, it's brilliantly written. All of it's brilliant. But it doesn't really give us what's going on in terms of, the horror and what's happening in the Nerva Beacon. And I completely get where you're coming from with where the construction is very clever. But it still feels to me like a little bit of an outlier. But I think
No, I think that's fair. But again, I suppose for me, it's presumably there might be an aspect of which that's a budget thing.
Yes.
Because, and again, this comes down to what I'm saying about, it's one of the reasons I kind of feel weirdly odd about criticising almost any Doctor Who to a degree, because there's at least part of me kind of going, I know what you might have wanted to do, but you couldn't do it and you've had to do this instead.
Yes.
And I came up with this phrase I was discussing with some writing students the other week, this thing of going, what was the way of putting it? You've got to look at your restrictions.
Yes, your constraints.
Your constraints and make them your positives. So the negatives of what you're doing, you've got to make it a positive. So he said, well, I can only afford these actors for this episode. Let's make it a tense, tight character piece.
Yes.
And that saves the money in order to use however many extras they've got in the remaining episodes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So moving on, let's park the first episode and get into the story proper. And episode 2 is terrifying. When I watched it as a kid, I was absolutely terrified in many ways about it. And there's a queasy brilliance to the plot that it's full of just sick ideas. Noah's body, the alien infection, the whole, the worst bit of David Attenborough's life on Earth is those wasps that lay their eggs inside the bodies of other insects and wait for them to grow. And it's really horrific stuff. So how do you feel about the horror in terms of how Holmes is building it?
Well, it's the thing, isn't it? Because as we said, I mean, it's not the first time it's been scary as such, because we're obviously not that far from like the spiders and the maggots and things like that. But it is taking it to a very different place, isn't it? Because it is it's an invasion of a different sort. It's going somewhere much darker, and it's about the loss of soul and the loss of identity. So that's perhaps a useful way of approaching it, because, I mean, obviously, this far on, all special effects in Doctor Who look shit. In classic series Doctor Who, they all look shit now. It's a great level at time. There isn't much difference between the Wirren and the Plasmatons. But certainly it becomes this point where it is the horror ultimately has to lie in the story rather than what you're necessarily seeing. So, yes, is it Kenton Moore? Is that his name? I can't remember the guy playing Noah.
Yes.
Kenton something. Him obviously looking at his hand at the end of episode 2 from a modern perspective. I was watching it with a 7-year-old who was going, I think I know how they did that. Going, yeah, everybody does. Everybody does.
I don't think I did at the time.
Expression. Yeah, not at the time. Yeah. Not at the time, it's fine. But now, you can't watch that. You're going, I think that might be bubble wrap. And when he's like slamming it down on the table, you're going, is he just enjoying popping it? Is that what he's doing? But that kind of, but why that scene still works is because of the intensity of what the actor's doing and the general horror. So the scariest bit for me in the whole episode isn't, the effect, isn't the attack on various people. It's the moment when he says, but I'm here, I'm due. When it's something creepy, the clear invasion of his mind, and this is not the man he thought he was, and that invasion of self rather than invading of the planet in the future. That doesn't mean anything to me, but I'm no longer me.
I think that's spot on there. There's another layer to it as well. I don't know. I don't know if I'm just the only person who's picked this up, or maybe you have as well. But Holmes talks about, or the characters talk about, how they don't want the regressives as part of the gene pool. They don't want the regressives invading the gene pool, which is thematically exactly what the Wirren have done. So there's 2 layers of where the Wirren are just as bad as the people who don't want the less, the less genetically pure people in their gene pool. So it's muddying the morality of it. Who are the bad, are the Wirren as bad as us? Are we as bad as the Wirren? Are the Wirren just surviving?
Yeah, because it's one of the genius of the story is admittedly quite late in the day in episode 4, Holmes coming up with an actual motivation for the Wirren that isn't as simple as we're just aliens and we're just eating you because you're here and you're food. It takes the time, it's a little bit throwaway and they don't particularly dwell on the moral implications of this, but it's just an extra layer of nuance. And as you say, it does start to ask those questions, even if it doesn't necessarily worry too much about answering them. It's trying to do a bit more than a lot of stories up to that point. I can't really think of that many examples before that.
No, I agree.
I mean, obviously, apart from some Malcolm Hulke stuff, and the various versions of the Silurians and Sea Devils. But yeah, it's trying to do more than it needs to. And as you say, that presents you with the argument of, is everyone bad? Who's bad? And what's going on? And ultimately, the Doctor has to do it just to save the race that we're familiar with, that is his favourite. Does that make the Doctor just a racist? I don't know. So,
well, I don't want to go down. I mean, I've had these conversations over the years, which I sure have. I mean, the Doctor has committed genocide enough times. Probably, he's committed genocide more times than Hitler. So, he's not without blood on his hands. But I think he tries to do it for all the best reasons. And Holmes is very, very good at fitting difficult moral, gnarly things in his stories. If you look at the Carnival of Monsters, what he does, about the treatment of animals and the treatment of slave races in the Carnival of Monsters, there's a lot of that there. There's a lot of, colonialism, critique of colonialism, I guess, in Carnival of Monsters. And here, it's these Wirren are just doing their thing. They're not evil in that sense. They just happen to have evolved this way of doing things that is really quite horrific. And I think maybe that's informed a lot of post-2005 Doctor Who, because one of the recurring tropes of post-2005 Doctor Who, and I don't know if you feel this as well, is things doing what they're supposed to do that accidentally kill us. If you look at, Curse of the Black Spot and even the Doctor Dances and, what's the first episode of that called?
Empty Child.
Empty Child. That's just the machine doing what it's supposed to do, but it kills us by accident. So I think what Holmes' morality is always on show. He's not just writing straight adventure pants. He's not just writing an action movie. He's making you think and watch as well. And as a writer, I try to do that, and I'm sure you try to do that as well, don't you?
I mean, it's interesting in terms of what you're saying. I think it is something I've come across a few times, and certainly as a script editor, occasionally things where I'm going, is it right for the Doctor to just want to destroy these things that are largely just trying to survive and just be somebody? And so I tried to avoid that and suggest people away from that. I noticed it recently, like a lot of people have been watching The Mandalorian, and the first 2 episodes of the second season, both of them have the Mandalorian taking out some giant animal that just is largely just like eating to survive. And first one, eating to survive, and the other one is in a cave he happens to crash into. And you go, I think it's a little bit unfair, really, that you've just crashed into the spider's cave and then you just burn them all to death and all of their kids because you just happen to have crashed badly.
Is that because we're more aware of that kind of moral dimension now that we even notice that?
Yeah, I suspect so. I mean, I think at the very least, in terms of what Holmes is doing in The Ark in Space, it's making it less of an easy solution.
Yes.
Because, just killing, it's just animals. If they're just brainless animals, you can probably get away with just killing them. But it's got an intelligence and a history.
Yes.
And a reasonable grudge.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So at the very least, there's a degree to which it kind of, you cheer the end because they are still horrible. And I think it was the Douglas Adams thing, isn't it, where he says the ideal Doctor Who villain is someone with a reasonable aim to go about in an unreasonable way.
Yes.
Yeah, which is like the Scarab being the epitome of that. And I suspect that's true, because I think the thing in terms of what the Wirren do, they don't necessarily need to convert the ark. They can probably just find somewhere else, I think, is at least the message, or something that isn't intelligent to deal with.
But
and
they
at least
are
partially motivated by revenge.
They are just wasps building a wasp's nest in your attic, aren't they?
Yeah.
That's all they really are. And, how we go about exterminating. We don't think twice, even now, about exterminating wasps. I don't know if you've ever had mice in your house, but we use the, the mice are just trying to earn a living in our house.
Yeah.
During the summer. So we put down the humane traps, and then, every morning if we've got 3 or 4 mice, we drive them out to the country and release them.
Yeah, you have to, don't you? Yeah.
But 40 years ago, they would have been killed on a trap. So it's interesting how things have moved on. So that's the moral dimension of Ark in Space. And again, I love that gnarly stuff. What do you think about how Holmes has built his world? I think, before we talk about characters, I think the language that the Nerva Beacon staff use, where they talk about snitch and it's a snitch up and beautiful and all of those, he's very good at using, and here he's created vernacular that tells us it's the future. Holmes is very good at vernacular. I was speaking to Mark Morris the other day on doing one of these, and of course we were doing Talons of Weng Chiang, which is Mark Morris's favourite story, and there's all that upazootics and fantastic vernacular. Here he's creating vernacular, so he's world building. Holmes's world building is exemplary in this as well, isn't it?
Yeah, he struck me very much as, it's him and Chris Boucher, I think, are probably the best at using the minimum amount of detail to create a clear sense of the world.
Yes.
And it's true of the characters as well, but we'll get on to them. So, I think it doesn't need much just to give you a sense. I think even things that are exposition, like the various random voiceovers you get, the one at the beginning of episode 3 and stuff like that, the people doing the messages from the past, just give you a little bit of a sense. And it's all you need, really. It doesn't need masses more than that. There are little throwaway things about there being other ships, other things going on. And I think that's one of the skills of it. I think I've talked about this in terms of research, because I think it also works in historical stuff as well. Yeah. And it's probably a way of looking at it. I always say to people, do as much research as you can, and then try to use as little of it as humanly possible.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that really helps. Yeah, because I think he's clearly got a strong sense of what the world is, but doesn't feel the urge to tell us. He tells us when he needs to tell us.
Yes.
Which I think is definitely the best way of going about these things.
I absolutely agree. And I think you don't want to overload the viewer, listener, reader with too much exposition. The phrase I use, and I've used it before, so people will be bored with this if they've listened to all of the podcast, is you've got to smuggle exposition in.
Yeah.
You don't want to say, oh, this happened, that happened, and this happened because of that happened. But if you can just say a line, say a word, an action, and that's the skill of the script writer, I think, because I've read scripts and I've seen things where the exposition is absolutely appalling, and it stops everything dead. We're just 2 people talking in a room, and it's saying something to the other person in the room that they already know, just for the benefit of us, the viewers.
It's one of the things I've found, again, working in audio, not to talk too much about that, and certainly people like diving in, trying to do descriptive stuff quite early on, is just that sense of going, how much do people actually need? Yeah. How much do people need? I think there was one early on, and I won't say who wrote it, because they've done a lot since and they've got a lot better, where it was describing a satellite. And it was like, it's got red lights here and flashing things. You go, who cares? It's a satellite. That's all they need for the plot. It's a satellite. And it's something else I discovered. I think I wrote a short film ages ago. And it was about sort of Dungeons and Dragon role player types. And I realized as I was going through it, I don't need to explain what any of these things are. No. If I say what a D20 is, people don't actually listening to that need to know. No. Really, you'll get a vague sense of what it is from the context of what it is and the consequences of it. The actual specific, it's this slightly counterintuitive thing. I think people actually prefer it when you have less information.
Yes.
Spelling out too much just makes it look like you've done your research, you're filling in the exposition.
Yeah.
Whereas just hinting at it just suggests a world and this thing going, this is not my world. It's just enough to give me a sense of what their world is like. But they're ultimately people, and you understand how people interact, and that's the most important part.
So our world building is exemplary in this story, and Holmes has worked very hard at this. I love going to Robert Holmes's worlds. I love, the Carnival of Monsters. I love Sunmakers. I think, those are that fascinated me as a kid. The Sunmaker, those very tall buildings on Pluto, and just fantastic world building. So there is this cliche in Doctor Who about the Holmes double act.
Yeah.
Which I suppose is fair enough. But how about Holmes in the way he's created his characters, specifically in Ark in Space?
The thing I found interesting with this, again, going back to the sort of technical stuff, is he's clearly kind of working to a budget.
Yeah.
If you actually analyse it properly, because there are the two guys...
Rogan and Lysett?
No, Libri.
Oh, Libri,
and Lysett.
Yes.
Who are both basically there to get bumped off within one episode, because you can't have them back for the next episode because you have to pay them extra. And they are just there as red shirts. But they don't come across as red shirts. That's the thing. I mean, Libri in particular, I think, is weirdly remarkable because he can't be in more than about 5 minutes, if that. But you get enough of a little... So again, it comes out to a thing of you get enough.
Yes.
Most of these characters don't have the time to demonstrate much character per se. I mean, there is an argument that character is a function of plot and plot is a function of character and so on and so forth. But this is a survival thriller. They're largely not getting that much of opportunity apart from just go, I need to try and stay alive.
Yes.
Libri is interesting because you just get enough, this sense of a little bit of nervousness and a little bit of hesitation and wanting to follow the orders and not being willing to shoot Noah, even when it is clearly the thing he needs to do, even leading to his own death. And so that's literally just in a couple of lines that just gives you enough for the actor to hang on to. Lysett is the other one who Lysett is probably the least successful one, I'd say, because perfectly well done, but I couldn't tell you anything about him really off the top of my head. It's just that sense of going,
he's just there, isn't he?
Yeah. But then you kind of, again, you sort of need that. There are some people who just have to be there to be the background. This is the thing. I remember I've occasionally read the suggestions of the BBC writers' room. They'll always say every character, you should be able to cover up the characters' names and be able to figure out whose dialogue is it. And we go, that's a lovely idea. It doesn't work practically.
No, it doesn't.
It really doesn't.
Not in science fiction space pants, really, where somebody wants you want to kill them off pretty quickly.
Say in a lot of cases it's almost just a little bit too much. Everybody, particularly if they work together in the same sort of precinct, tends to gravitate towards the same sort of language, I think. And I don't think if everyone starts talking in really distinctive speech patterns, I think it would start sounding ridiculous. I don't think it happens that often. So that's, I kind of think, why it doesn't entirely matter that he's a little bit of the one who you can't get a handle on that much. Because it allows the others. It's the contrast. He's the straightforward one. So you've got the one who's a little bit weak-willed, and then you've got the other one who's a little bit cynical. Yeah. And Rogan is obviously probably the most successful one, at least because he's got a couple of episodes to play with. Gets some great opening lines, gets great beats in episode 4. But again, really deftly thrown away, because most of the time, everything he's saying is fairly generic. Most of the time, but not all. And it's those little extra bits. I think I wrote a line about this, and I suddenly realized in a script, and I realized that it kind of applies to doing character. We're saying people are defined by what they do not need to do. So if you, in terms of say eating is a good example. Yeah. If you eat only as much as you need to eat, that's not a character point. If you don't eat enough, if you kind of undereat, that gives you a bit of personality. If you overeat, that gives you a bit of personality. It's the things that you don't need to do. So if you see what I mean. Undereating is probably,
I've not heard that before. Is that unique to you, or is that you picked that up from somewhere else?
It's just something I thought, I think I wrote it as a line and then realised it was a thing where I was having a discussion with people. I thought, actually, you can apply that to character. So think about what they don't need to say. So you get the character from the things in Rogan's case, it's the things where I could be happily dead. And that tiny beat where, is he actually joking about, we could just go now? We could just go? But it's enough. Those little details of where he deviates from the norm are where you get the character. And I think it only needs to be in a survival thriller, it doesn't need to be that much.
That is really very smart, and I'm writing it down. That's very good. Now, one of the staples of action writing, I'm sure you know this, is the countdown clock.
Yes.
And finding new and interesting ways to have the rising tension because you're running out of time. Holmes takes that from the larval stages of the Wirren, and they're going to actualize at some point. That's a really clever device as well. Taking something that we recognize, he could have stuck a clock in it, he could have stuck, like a countdown clock or whatever, but using the body horror aspect as your countdown clock, because it's, the Wirren are going to come and they're going to lay their eggs in us. I think that's very smart as well. It's just full of smart Robert Holmes stuff, I think.
Yeah, smart Robert Holmes stuff when he had to bash it out to a tight brief. And finding a story, because it isn't, as I say, I read the original and it's really not that similar. It kind of starts off, I remember reading episode 1, kind of go, it's a bit disappointing. Has Holmes basically borrowed everything and just extended it. And then the further it gets in, you kind of go, oh no, he clearly hasn't. Yeah. I mean, it's got a similar nominal, that thing of it's a survival thriller. It's these people are doing this, these people are doing this. It's a bit, the original is a bit more TV comic, really. So yeah, I think it feels like that this is, if anything, it made me appreciate Holmes being a bit of a genius, really.
Yes.
In his genre, which is obviously a thing that can be looked down on and treated very poorly. As I think, was it Russell T Davies or Stephen Moffat saying, if he'd written like a play for today all the time, he'd be regarded as one of the greatest TV writers of all time, and he just isn't, because he largely stuck to genre pieces, but they are like the best genre pieces you can see. Absolutely. And then when you analyze them, you can see that this is, remarkable work, and the elegance of the structure and the simplicity of it is what I think it makes. And so the clock is there, but it isn't as overt. There is,
but it's there.
But it's straightforward tension. Exactly. Yeah. You know what the scenario is, and it's always tightening the screws. And I kind of like that. I feel like I can almost see that that's how it's structured in a degree. He set himself the timer. And I feel this because I've written something of this sort before, not that I'm doing the comparison, but it feels like he writes himself into a corner and goes, right, how do I get out of that? Let's do this then. And then keeps having to get out of it, and then has the moments of inspiration to get him out of it. But as long as he's got that timer, he knows that this is where I've got to get to. And then I think when you do those sort of things, you just hope people aren't going to be ahead of you.
I absolutely agree. And I think what's great about Ark in Space is it uses very much lots of traditional structure in terms of action, space, writing. But it doesn't feel, because it's so lifted, it's so horrific, and he smuggles in the world building so beautifully. You never feel like you're being hit on the head by the writer. You feel like you're just being dragged into something so horrific. But it is a very traditional story, as well as not feeling totally traditional.
Yeah, it's interesting to say you've got the elements of traditional science fiction. There's also a degree to which it's got certain sort of war thrillers and things like that. So you can see traces of something like, say, Zulu. Zulu is earlier, isn't it? I think. Yeah. But that's, again, a kind of we're under attack, it's relentless, we just have to keep surviving, and what do we do now? So there's a fairly classical basis of where he's going with, which is why I think it focuses quite on a straightforward simplicity. It's always whatever the next problem is. But then you can see, not that I think Alien or Aliens were particularly influenced by it, but you can see traces following along that route.
I've considered that. The Alien, just a few years later, very much. I mean, maybe it wasn't, but, you could
it's
imagine...
It's not implausible.
You can imagine that they've seen it.
Maybe. If Ridley Scott could direct an episode of Adam Adamant Lives, it's not entirely implausible that he could...
Wasn't he up for... I don't know if he was up for Unearthly Child or up for The Daleks, Ridley Scott.
Yeah.
So something very early. So I can imagine that Ridley Scott would be aware of the Ark in Space, because there's lots of it. I'm not sure if Dan O'Bannon would have been, but I can imagine that Ridley would have seen that, and space insects, a base under siege in space, because there's that other traditional thing. It's a locked, our characters are trapped, they can't get out, whatever that is. Maybe the bridge in westerns, the bridge would be down, or in a war story they're stuck in a town with the Germans all around them, or whatever. Again, there's those traditional elements to it, but I think I love the way that it embraces those kind of things, but doesn't hang its hat on them, doesn't rely on them.
It still feels fresh.
So in terms of, let's look at the overarching plot. Let's talk about plot. And again, it's a base under siege. It's, the bridge is out, the snowstorm has knocked out, we can't drive out of town. We can't get out of here. We're stuck and we've got to deal with this. How do you think Holmes develops his plot or how well he develops his plot?
I suppose it comes back to what I said about episode 1 in this sort of fascinating engineering work of how everything seems to kind of dovetail. This reverse engineered episode 1 that kind of trickles back through episode 2 a little bit to a certain degree before it then veers off in its own direction. I feel, if anything, it feels to me like he's at least partially been led by his constraints. So, yeah, if he's had to have only a limited amount of characters, he's gone, right, like, how do we work that and get the tension and develop that with the limited amount we've got? And therefore it becomes, we've got to just lock them down in a room and figure out how we get out of that room. And then what's the problem here? It's ultimately quite straightforward. And it's not the most plotted Doctor Who story you've ever got, but I've kind of largely been of the belief that plot is almost unimportant, because ultimately that, you know, there's that thing about there are only sort of 7 plots, which is possibly true, possibly untrue, but there aren't masses. And
it's what you
do. Exactly. It's things like character and the dialogue and things like that are what you buy and what you're excited by. You know, all of your favorite films, if you kind of go back to it, you're largely kind of going, I mean, it's because I like the characters rather than I necessarily like the specific story. So the story itself is relatively straightforward and simple. It is almost entirely A to B to C to D until we've figured out a way of defeating these things. There isn't really a build as such other than the inherent countdown, but it's not like, it's kind of almost a bit like The Martian, I suppose. Here's a problem, let's fix this problem.
Another problem.
But getting towards an end. Yeah, exactly. Another problem. And by fixing this problem, we develop another problem. So it's a chain in event. But there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It doesn't have to be intricate. And there's something to be said for something that is relatively straightforward comparatively, I would say.
Do you think it's and I don't want to get all woke on this because that would really bore me, but do you think if Harry had been trapped dragging the power cable through the insulation air conditioning tunnel, whatever, do you think the Doctor would have treated him different than he treated Sarah? I
suspect so, because Harry would probably go, yes, I am useless. I'm so terribly sorry about that, Doctor. Goodness, I've let everyone down. You've probably just leave me here. You know. Yes. So he would have had to have come up with a different thing. And I suppose that comes down to what we say about plot and character being a function of each other. Yeah. In terms of, there's at least part of it is a degree that it has to be Sarah because she's small, but then also because Sarah is the one who, if she gets stuck, there's a way of getting her out. Yeah. Whereas Harry is kind of out of his depth on his first voyage, his first encounter with aliens, for crying out loud. I mean, I'm just delighted he isn't like largely wetting himself every time he stares out the window. So in a weird way, it's kind of, it probably works in the sense you go, Harry would be more useless in that scenario. Not that he's, but he's got a very different skill set, and they use him very effectively as well, I think.
Obviously, when I saw it as a kid, it never occurred to me that the Doctor was using the misogynistic idea that women are emotional, and you know the way to get them to do things is by telling them they're useless and, you know, make them angry. But it's only now, looking at it now, that I feel we probably wouldn't have written that like that now.
Yeah, you might have. Harry, I was thinking you might go, you're a disgrace to the Navy. Just something to rile him up a different way. But I know what you mean. You probably, I suspect you could get away with the same thought. Yes. But it's kind of the useless girl. You wouldn't necessarily kind of do it in that kind of way. I mean, that's the other thing, I suppose. We've also got to remember I can't remember what order they filmed this season in, because I know obviously Robot is from the previous run, isn't it? And then is it fourth? I have a feeling, I don't know. I lose track completely. But at the very least, they are still finding their way in terms of what Tom does. And I think that kind of grumpy anger, I mean, there's residues of Pertwee perhaps there, but there's something a little bit more knowing about it, I would say. So, but I think you could get away with the same thought, but you'd have to phrase it slightly different. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to denigrate the story just for, for that moment, because that is a moment that is in a lot of our subconsciousness as one of the great moments from the story. But when you dig underneath it, it's a little problematic. In that sense, but at the same time, at least part of that is down to the fact that Sarah is of her time as well. You wouldn't write a character who's nominally a women's liver, entirely written by men, and who kind of mentions it once or twice and then largely forgets. Yeah, you wouldn't do that these days at all. No. So, yes, you wouldn't write the response that Tom has to at the same time, but at the same time, you wouldn't have written a character like that. So it's all very much of its time. This is the thing. I was in a tour of an Alan Ayckbourn play this time last year. Absurd Person Singular, which is, a magnificent piece of work. Great play. Oddly enough, I played the first time I saw it, I kind of go, yes, okay. And then I was doing it, I was going, oh no, this is stunning. Guy's a genius. Absolute genius. What was glorious with that, this is going off on a tangent, was it was a lot of people who didn't know Ayckbourn terribly well with the rest of the cast. Oh, and so all a bit going, he's a bit fuddy-duddy, he's a bit Middle England, isn't he? And then the further we get into the play, going, oh my God. I completely underrated. This is... this is superb. And it's because they'd only seen the later stuff, which isn't as good, frankly. But yeah, the reason I mention that is the thing I found intriguing with that, and I think this happens with art in general, is it's very much of its time. It's very much a seven-piece play, so the person singular. The character I was playing was a monumental arsehole. And certain lines he'd have and say at different times were really uncomfortable to say and to bring up. But I increasingly realized the further I was going into it, that meant the play itself was a living, breathing organism.
Yeah.
So that how the audience was reacted in the 70s is very different from how they would react to it now. That doesn't necessarily mean that either reaction is less valid than the other one.
No.
Because the piece is alive. And what you're saying is true about people in that time. And so suddenly the reactions the audience have are more, wow, this guy's an arsehole, than they would have been in the 70s, perhaps. But that doesn't, it starts saying something different. And it means that the play is still happening. The play is alive. It's in the gap between you and the audience. And I think that's true of, again, even to bring it back to the Ark in Space, it's true of the Ark in Space. So there's a slightly different texture to that moment than we would have had when it was originally transmitted. But that's an interesting texture.
That's a brilliant way of summing it up. And my Radio 2 link head on, talking of summing up, how do you think Robert Holmes wraps it all up? Is it a satisfying ending to Ark in Space? I
think so. I think it again comes down to that sort of delicacy of character. It manages to make things that feel like a cliche, like the heroic sacrifice bit of Rogan at the end, not feel like it's a cliche. So, and I think a lot of that is down to the performance. He's very good. I can't remember his name. The guy out of Weather Fear, isn't it? And just little tiny details. It's that fatally melancholic look down the stairs, the pause on the stairs before he goes down when he kind of knows, I think I'm going to have to do this, aren't I?
Yeah.
That works into it. So it's a character you genuinely like just from those tiny little grace notes. So there's that. And then it leaves you with this beautiful little enigmatic detail about how much of Noah was still there.
Still there,
And so the resolution is kind of tied to character. And these little details about him and Vira and this tiny backstory that you get that just is enough. Yeah, I think it manages, if you kind of think about it, it breaks some of the rules. So this rocket there is, you can see it on the model, but they never mention it.
No.
At any point until, okay, we need to kind of find another. And that I think is to a degree this slight of started, it's just going to be what it is, plotting, I think that Holmes does. That he eventually figures out, oh, this is how I need to finish it. So I haven't mentioned it that much earlier. So, well, we'll just have to run with it. But again, manages to cover it up and deals with it so beautifully and writes it so well that it kind of doesn't matter.
Yeah, I agree.
Because it's more focused on the character. Again, more focused on the character than the actual plot mechanics. So it's Rogan and Noah and Vira, their reactions to the ending are what make it work, rather than necessarily, it's a straightforward solution. Bung them in a rocket, blow it up.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's satisfying because of character.
Yeah, I agree. The whole Noah still being present in the Wirren thing, I extrapolated on that. I did an audio about the Wirren for BBV years ago called Race Memory, where at the end of it, the Wirren have beaten and assimilated so many humans that when they lay their next eggs, babies come out. They actually become human.
That's lovely.
In a kind of like the monsters become us and we become the monsters, which I thought was always, again, I love Ark in Space, but I always wanted more of that idea that they were assimilating humanity and whoever they assimilated. So yeah, I love the Wirren as a character. I'd like to have seen more of them as a species, but yeah.
I think ironically they had legs.
Very good. Go to your room.
Yay. Cheap pun.
Yeah, you already are. Right, okay. John, that was brilliant talking about Ark in Space. Fantastic. There. Was there anything else that you wanted to, I don't know if you had any extra things about Ark in Space to say before we stop this bit?
Nothing leaps to mind.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Hilarious reading the original script, just because it's I love the fact that the villain, whatever he's called, Nirab, and you go, that's just an anagram of brain, isn't it? Or Brian.
Or Brian, yeah.
So I thought of Brian as well, because obviously the planet is called Clever or something. And it's just this bit going, really? You really were better at the historicals, weren't you? Jeez.
Well, yeah, his historicals are amazing. That was brilliant, John. Really, really fabulous.
Oh, fantastic. Glad it worked for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was exactly what I want from these things. That kind of writerly stuff. It's exactly what I want. And now we're back for the second half of A Sledgehammer. And we're going to talk about John as a writer, about his process, about how he makes shit up, which is 90% of the job of a writer.
Making shit up.
Making shit up. And also, because John is the preeminent audio writer, certainly with Big Finish, I want to talk about how to write audios, which is very much close to my heart too. So, John, what is audio writing?
I think it's, in a weird way, I think the easiest answer to that is it's writing. It's just writing. It's the same as anything. I think it's what I've mentioned about, I think it's thinking about it in a different way. I think it's being aware of what a medium is and what its strengths are and using those strengths as and what its negatives are and using those negatives as a strength.
Yeah.
So obviously you can't see anything. That's not necessarily a problem. It makes things a bit more personal. People tend to listen to it through headphones. You can listen to it while going out for a jog or like driving. It becomes a much more immediate and interactive thing. But then it's thinking, well, what do I gain people being unable to see things? What's useful? So, for example, it's very, very good for comedy because you can time reveals of information and means that everybody gets the joke at exactly the same point. Things like that. But ultimately, for me, it kind of feels like I don't feel it feels massively different from other forms of writing. Maybe that's my specific biases and will cause problems for me if I try anything else.
I remember back in the 80s and 90s when I was trying to break into radio and TV, the BBC, they didn't have the writer's room at the time. You could just send into any of the script units around the country. And they had this audio writing guide that started, I think it was written by Paul Mayhew Archer, I believe, that said radio is the easiest thing to turn off.
Oh, that's good, yeah.
Because there's no pictures to lock you in, you've not invested in buying a DVD or a Blu-ray or VHSs at the time. But yeah, it's the easiest thing to turn off. So you have to work a lot harder to keep, because again, it needs so much of the audience's imagination.
That's true. I mean, I think at the same time, it's kind of a weird thing relating to that. It's the easiest medium to do something else at the same time. In fact, that's what I tend to find I have to, because I'm a bit attention deficit. If it's actually sitting in a room, just listening to it through the headphones, I'll get distracted and I'll do something else. If I'm driving or if I'm going for a jog or doing something like that, that will occupy enough of my brain that I can actually listen to it properly. So yeah, I suppose there is a degree to which you are needing to grab people's attentions more and information as easily and gently as possible. It's a weird thing because obviously I've been doing it for over a decade now, so it kind of almost is something I don't think about.
Yes.
I can probably turn any scene into something that works on audio without really much thought about it at all, even something quite visual, not that I tend to think those. I like the idea of it being easy to turn off, but then at the same time, it's also quite easy to leave on. There's a thing about you never change a radio channel.
No, that is true. And it's almost the opposite of what we're taught as screenwriters. When I read screenwriting books, every scene as a screenwriter, you're told should be able to work without words. And that's almost, if you look at cinema, so much television, which is like that halfway house between radio and television. So it's much more wordy than cinema can be, unless you're Quentin Tarantino or whatever. Scenes should work with the least amount of words as possible, is what we're told. So again, audio becomes a quite specific skill that not everybody can do. I've heard, I'm not going to mention names, but I've heard some terrible radio plays. And there's that brilliant comedy play, I can't remember who wrote it, called The Gun in My Right Hand is Loaded. I don't know if you've heard it.
I've heard it, yeah.
And so that is a radio play about the pitfalls of audio writing. So did you have to learn the hard way or did it come quite easily?
I think when I started, which was probably, as I say, doing radio sketches, I think I was in the very fortunate position that I'd listened to a lot of the Big Finish stuff.
Yeah.
So I probably picked up some ideas of how to do it quite early on. Also, as I say, comedy in terms of like timing of reveals. Yeah. Comedy is a great way of learning the basics of it, radio comedy in particular, of doing audio, because one of the easiest ways of disguising, say, exposition, disguising visuals, throw in a joke.
Yes.
Cover it with a joke. And I gave an example once ages ago, which was I wrote a script called The Foe from the Future, which was based on Robert Banks Stewart's original storyline for what then was replaced and became Talons of Weng-Chiang. Yeah. And there was one point where I needed these monsters to turn up. I needed there to be 3 of them, and I needed the audience to know it was 3. It wasn't 4, it wasn't 2, it was 3.
It had to be 3
for the plot.
Yeah.
But how do you say, wow, look at those 3 monsters who've just turned up? Which some people do.
Yes, they do.
But the way I covered it was that I gave the doctor a line going, oh, you wait all day for a pantophage and then 3 of them turn up at once. And that's it. You've given the information. Yes. You've disguised it with a joke. I was writing a play last week where it got it's a bit of a plot twisty one. And there was one really key bit of information the audience needed to know.
Mm-hmm.
And I placed it quite early on. And just finding a way of going, and let's make that into a joke, and finding a separate reason for everything else to be there is generally. But there's another bit where it kind of like it led into a bit more of an argument. You go, that looks like it's setting up this conversation in the way it goes. Actually, it's giving you this crucial bit of information that I don't want you to notice yet, but it's there because you need it for the ending. Things like that.
That's very clever.
There's a great one. My favorite bit of movie exposition ever, Scream 2.
Yeah.
Which I know sounds a really niche one. The spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen Scream 2 is it needs to give you a vital bit of information about the previous film, or remind you of a piece of information about the previous film for the finale of this one to make sense.
Yeah.
Basically needs you to remind you that Billy, the killer of the first one, had a mother because the mother is the killer. And the mother went away and did all that. That's what it needs you to know. How do you present that information without saying, hey, this might be important? You remember the killer in the first one who had a mother who went away. Why are you mentioning that? Oh, is she the killer? Perhaps. And can you remember where they conceal it?
No, I can't. I've seen it once. Oh. My partner, Tazza, she loves a Scream film. She would be able to tell you, but I can't.
Yeah. Where they hide it is the information is provided in the film within the film. Basically, in the first film, they have this gag about I'd probably be played by Tori Spelling. And they show a clip of Tori Spelling playing Nev Campbell's part. And the discussion she has with Billy, the killer, is about going, your mother ran off with my dad. All of the information is contained within that. So you're distracted by the joke, but you are given the information.
Jesus.
It's brilliantly done.
That's very clear. Kevin, who's the guy who writes the Scream films? Kevin
Williamson,
yeah. My favourite Williamson film is The Faculty. I think that's brilliant. That's a fantastic film. So, audio writing, you served your apprenticeship writing radio sketches, say, but there are certain things to avoid in audio writing. Exposition not smuggled in effectively is one of them. What are the other, before we look at the positives, what are the other things to avoid?
I think there are fairly obvious ones, like try not to have people on their own.
Yeah.
Because if they're on their own, they are just talking to themselves. And I've been known to talk to myself, but don't do like full monologues.
No.
I think if you have someone stuck on their own, what I tend to do is make their speech a bit more sporadic.
Yeah.
So it's like, where you kind of like muttered words.
Yes.
I don't think it's wrong to have someone talk to themselves. I'd always suggest to be careful about narration because I don't mind narration at all. I quite like narration. I have used it. I think it works best when you are using it like you would say voiceover in a film.
Yeah.
I don't like the idea of too much of it describing what you're doing because otherwise you go, well, why are you writing an audio?
Yeah.
You're just pretending you're not a book. Occasionally you can use it to help out in those things, but try, I would say, not to lean in it too much. It comes down to, I think, the story you're starting off with and being always aware of that and that this is unlikely to be a visual thing. You should probably avoid it being too visual. Don't think about it in terms of visuals. Think about it in terms of story. I can't think of that many other real sort of obvious pitfalls. I mean, mainly because hopefully it's been a while since I've fallen into any of them. Over description. Yes. Over description is probably another one. Most of the time, I can appreciate this desire to let people know where you are and what's going on. But most of the time, people don't need as much as you think they do.
No.
Give them enough to follow the plot, but don't feel that you have to explain what colour everything is because no one really cares.
Would you advise people to use the audio, make stories that work in an audio way rather than trying to we're not going to have too much description and our exposition is going to be well smuggled. But if you're telling a story that is dependent on the visuals that you're creating, do you think that that's a pitfall people fall into?
It can be. I mean, here, I'm going to potentially contradict myself. I find it interesting when people will say things like, well, this story could only work on audio. Because most of the time, I think I may have mentioned this before, most of the time I don't think it could. That it's just the way you've told the story helps that happen. Because I think ultimately almost all stories can be told in almost all mediums. There must be exceptions. But what it also means is that doesn't mean necessarily that every story will be at its best told in a particular medium, I suppose. Sometimes that's contradictory because I think when people say, okay, well, great, this could only work in audio, I think you don't say that about that many other mediums, really. No. And it's never usually a plus in other mediums. So if it's something like, say, theatre, if you say this could only be told on stage, it's something that's like one set. Yeah. That's a story that could really only make this work on stage. Whereas if I think about a lot of my most exciting theatrical experiences, just one that I think is a great example to mind, Warhorse. Yeah. Warhorse is a story told from the perspective of a horse that travels through the war. And you tell that to everyone and they kind of go, going to do that on stage? Are you insane? That's ridiculous. That couldn't possibly work. They go, yeah, we'll give it a go. So that's equally at the same time. Something that couldn't possibly work in its medium is a great thing to go with.
There's a very early Big Finish, which I think is by Justin Richards, which might have been the first Sixth Doctor one, where he's got a mute character in it. That's a constraint for audio that must have been really difficult to write around. But he's got a character in it who doesn't speak. And it's all about
I'm trying to think, because I know
it's probably the first Sixth.
Because I can't
Doctor
remember, it might be collating too. I can't entirely remember, because I know that there's a mute character in the Genocide Machine.
Yeah.
Maybe Nick played him.
Maybe.
Who basically kind of goes every time. But then
maybe I'm mixing
Whispers
them
of
up.
Terror, which is Colin's
Whispers of
first
Terror,
one, is very, I can't remember if there's a mute character, but they do Justin plays a lot with that. And I think at that point, when it's a new thing and it's literally the third release, that's absolutely fine. So he uses a few tricks that might seem a little bit outdated now, but at the time you go, no, this is just somebody who's going, let's see what we can do with this.
I thought it was clever.
Which I think is absolutely the right thing to be doing that early on.
Yeah, maybe I'm mixing up two stories.
It's something where I think
20 years ago. So
it might be an aspect of Genocide. I can't remember. I haven't heard either of them in a long time. I know Genocide definitely has Nick playing a character who doesn't speak or just goes every time. But there might be a mute in this. I could be completely wrong.
So unless you're writing a story called The Invasion of the Mime Artists, I probably agree with you that you can do anything in audio, but it's very easy to make bad audio, I think.
I'd say so.
I think you do really well. Now, so let's talk about your process. Now we've covered what audio writing is and what the things not to do. You write a lot of audio stuff. And I'm going to blow some smoke up your bottom now. There are two stories.
Fine, I'll go with that.
There are two audio stories which I think are the ones... Nobody's ever heard a Doctor Who type audio story before. There are two. One of them is Paul Maher's Nest Cottage. The first episode of that, which I know wasn't Big Finish, it was Audio Go, wasn't it? Which I think is
Stuff of Nightmares.
Yeah, it's an absolute masterpiece. It's a masterclass in writing. Great writing. And the other one is Your Absent Friends, which I
thank
think...
you.
No. It's credit where it's due, man. That's a remarkable piece of writing. And which uses audio as a device within it, the phone calls from relatives that you haven't had a chance to say goodbye to. And I know that it won an award, didn't it? It won the BBC Audio Award, so well done you, award-winning John Dorney, as I am contractually obliged to call you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also there was a dimension there that's personal. We don't have to go too deeply into that.
No.
But how did that story come about for you, and how did you create it? How did you write it? How did you work it?
It's a tricky one, actually, because that's one of the more interesting journeys from a writing perspective. I remember the thing we've danced around is basically my dad died to be honest, I completely lose track of the year. I think it's 2014. That was, 2014, September 2014. And I knew, because it's sort of what I do, there's part of me going, I will probably write about this at some point, because it feels like it's something worth writing about. And I didn't really come in with too much of a decision about when or where or how. But I remember coming up with the idea for Absent Friends and just having this brief moment of thinking, oh, okay, this will be the one then. This is the one about Dad. Okay. Oddly enough, I ended up writing two within about 6 months, because the other one that I think is about my dad is 529, River Song story I did. But that one I didn't realize until I'd written it. Where I just went, oh shit, this one's about terminal illness. This is Dad again, isn't it? Okay, right. Okay, never mind. And so I can't off the top of my head remember precisely how the idea came to me. Weirdly enough, I think I can remember where it happened. I think I was driving to the Big Finish studios in Kent to do a recording with Tom Baker. And I was listening to, I think, a Jago and Lightfoot. I can't remember which one. And there was just a line or something like that as I was driving that just made me go, oh, what about this? I have a faint feeling, I can't remember. I think it's the set which has Matthew Sweet's Freud story in it, but I can't entirely remember off the top of my head. I can't remember if that was the story. I've got a vague sense that was the set. And for whatever reason, this thought popped into my head of the story about people getting phone calls from their dead relatives and going, okay, so that'll be the story. The main thing I remember about writing it up was it was absolutely borderline impossible at times. Yeah. Not for any of the reasons of it being like personal or that kind of stuff. Just the structure of getting a plot to work was really tough.
At what point did you decide that it was going to be these phone calls, which everybody, the Doctor and Liv and Helen absolutely think is something horrible? At what point did you decide to flip that, where they become, this is a good thing that's happening? Was that always your intention, or did you?
I think it was always there.
All right, because it's such a mirror Doctor Who story. We think that this is something horrible. This is something, people are being terrible, pretending to be people's dead relatives. But it actually ends up to be a good thing. And that is, again, another innovative thing in Doctor Who. The menace, very rarely, turns out to be a positive. And I think that's another thing that really makes that story remarkable.
It was weird because I think there was, in the preview of Doom Coalition 3, Doom Coalition 4 in Doctor Who magazine, they started saying, well, there was a story last year which broke all of the rules. It didn't have a villain, didn't have a monster. And it's that moment we go, oh yeah, you're right. I hadn't realised when I was doing that. It's just you kind of figure out what the story is and what's right for it. And I think very early on I had crystallised in my head the idea of the 2 phone calls that Livchenko has with her dad, and that being the gap. And at least part of it was probably just down to the fact of going, it would be an amazing thing to be able to just speak to your dead relatives again, and just finding a way of making that work for the other characters as well. I seem to remember that Liv has a scene with the bereaved mother. That felt to me really important, to just find a way. Well, you've got to tell her this is her chance, but how do you sell that to someone? How do you persuade them this is actually happening and is real? So it's details like that, which is why it became quite a tricky write. It was more the kind of those sort of beats. Weirdly enough, the big emotional stuff, those Livchenko phone calls, I had in my head pretty much from the get-go, even to the degree when I submitted the storyline. That's how we work. We do a storyline, send it to producer, script editors, then it goes to the BBC, things like that. Yeah, even when I was submitting the original storyline, I seem to remember getting the note written in the storyline, Liv gets the phone call from her father, she's quite dismissive, and getting the note back of saying, oh, should we make her a bit warmer? Because we don't often get to see a sort of personal side to her character. And I just went, no, not there. That's the second call. We need the first call to be this, because I know what the second call is and I will break people's hearts.
Yeah, oh, you do.
Because it was the most heartfelt moment in the play. Is that phone call is exactly, it's not fair to say the entire situation for Dad is a vacant situation for mine. But the bits that were hard to write were things like Helen's stuff with her brother, which again was just needed, mainly because it was an argument that had to kind of just happen. Rather than it being a plot. Because if you've got 2 people talking about a plot, I know how to get there. But this was, I remember, it's one of the few times I've written it, gone, this isn't right. This needs to be expanded. I need to build this. This needs to work better. But I have to carry on with the rest of the script and I'll come back to this.
It is a great piece of writing, but also it's such a heavy subject, but you get some great laughs in there as well, where Liv says, I'm talking about a businessman, aren't I? When she realises that she's all the things about the smarmy, the beautiful hair. And it's like, when I first heard it, I thought we're going Autons. And I thought, because he's kind of like Channing, isn't he, in that kind of sense. Then it was something so prosaic as insider dealing. And then you've got this massive idea bomb of a time-travelling time anomaly that brings through nice phone calls. And I think the prosaicness of the insider dealing which you deal with, and it's just that. But wow, what a tower of brilliant ideas the phone calls are. It's a magnificent piece of writing. So,
thank you.
That's all right, mate. That'll be the end of the smoke blowing. Make the most of it. So, where does a script start with you? Where does the idea start? I'm not going to say, oh, can you tell us where you get your ideas, John? I don't care about that. I want to know where it all starts.
It starts, usually with a brief. And then if I don't have a brief, particularly, I will just make myself one. I use this as an example when I kind of like try to suggest writing tips for people. If you say to someone, tell me a story, they'll fluster and they won't be able to know where to start. But if you say, tell me a story about an elephant, they'll start going, okay, so there was once an elephant called George and he had an enormous trunk and the trunk got in and suddenly you can do it.
Yes.
And so that becomes to me the key point, is finding just a starting point is all it needs. And that can be all manner of things. It isn't necessarily, sometimes I always think about, it's interesting finding what breaks a story, how I think about it, where it goes from that point of going, there are a jumble of loosely disconnected ideas. Where does it actually turn from that into, and here's what I've got? And sometimes, and it can come from all manner of different things. So in one instance, it was figuring out where the story was set. That was another Doom Coalition story called Scenes from Her Life, which was set in a battered TARDIS floating in the vortex. And once I'd got that as an idea, I go, oh, I can write this now. And I did it in about a day and a half, the storyline. Others, it's as simple as just kind of playing around with it for ages, or then just reading something and go, oh, I like that book. I want to do something riffing on that kind of style or that kind of theme. It can be, what haven't I done for a while? So sometimes I go, I haven't done a scary one in a while. Let's do a scary one. I haven't done a funny one in a while. Let's do a funny one. Even to the degree where I think another play I was in once was play Hysteria, which is an incredibly dark farce. Sometimes isn't a farce. It's a remarkable piece of work. And I think I wrote 2 farces whilst I was doing that. I think My Dinner with Andrew and False Negative, which are both farces, were largely just by going, well, let's just do that because it's fun. And I'm now feeling I want to do another farce because they're great fun to do.
Excellent. So, in terms of stories, let's just focus down on Doctor Who for a moment.
Yes.
What are the ingredients that for you that would make something, an idea comes up that you say, I can use this in Doctor Who? Could you use any idea in Doctor Who? And what makes a Doctor Who story a Doctor Who story?
Well, that's a tricky thing, isn't it? I have a faint feeling, part of me feels it would be nice to say that any story could work in Doctor Who. I'm not entirely convinced that's the case.
No.
Not least because you have licensees and you have to appeal to various things in different places. I quite like the idea of trying to push the boundaries of what it is. I ended up 2 years ago now, writing a story for Stranded, where at least part of the impetus for that was the realization of going, we've never had a story that takes place now that has no science fiction, like it's historical. So what I thought of as a contemporary historical. Ended up writing what I think is an anti-Doctor Who story, if anything. But then by virtue of it not being a Doctor Who story, it defines what a Doctor Who story is. And I think a lot of Stranded does that as well. And there's a degree to which you can sort of tell almost anything. And by dropping the Doctor into it, it'll become a Doctor Who story, which I know sounds weirdly kind of trite way of going about it. But the Doctor does bend a story world around him.
Yeah.
Or her, obviously, in the current incarnation. And I think that can potentially make the difference, really, a lot of the time.
Could you envisage writing a Doctor Who story set in, say, Aleppo, in Syria, where everybody was getting chemically bombed? There
is a degree to which I'm aware of what the series is. I think there are some things where it would just be a bit tasteless. I wouldn't send the Doctor to Auschwitz. For example, it just seems a bit like, because ultimately this is like silly fanning around with an alien. Even if you took it as seriously as is humanly possible, you're being crass.
Yes.
The Doctor can't solve these situations by definition. So it just becomes really, really strange. And so I think that's probably about the limit of what you do.
Yeah.
But I suspect that might be the only, it might be a tasting. It might be just this sense of, ultimately this is a fun adventure series. And you've got to be aware of who the character is that you are dropping into things and whether that is an appropriate thing to do for that situation.
That would be like a setting, but you could probably do a metaphorical story. I mean, that's what science fiction is, isn't it? Science fiction is extrapolating on our experience now and telling a story, maybe in the future that's really about now. If you look at Day of the Daleks, that was about then. Really, in terms of the world situation. Mind of Evil was about then. So you could do it metaphorically. And what I've just recently read Terence's Day of the Daleks novelisation, which would have been very much what was going on with the IRA at the time, would have been very much something that might have informed that. But he doesn't call the guerrillas. He calls them guerrillas. He never calls them terrorists. He never says that, they're never called criminals or anything like that. And he could have done, but he didn't. I feel like there are ways of, if you look at most Doctor Who stories, there's some nasty stuff going on in a lot of them, really, really nasty stuff. But it's not the reality. It's not a documentary. So yes, I agree with you that taste and making sure that what you're doing isn't crass. But I don't think that there are ideas that you can't use, or there are situations that you can't extrapolate into science fiction. And I think the question is, should you? Or is that something that interests you, that you could look at things that are happening in the world today, but metaphorize them in a Doctor Who way on another planet?
I think I kind of have. Not necessarily with the Doctor Who. I've certainly done a few satires to varying degrees because I think I'm alive and in the world.
Yes.
You kind of react to whatever you've got. So I think probably the most notable one is I did a Donna story called Spinvasion. Which ultimately is very much influenced by the world we're in today. And it feels, and to be fair, I'm even thinking, I'm not 100% sure it needs to necessarily be that broken away. I'm slightly, the more I'm thinking about it, I'm ever so slightly going, you know what, you could potentially tell a story in a really awkward and crass environment. You just have to be incredibly deft with it. That's the thing. I thought, be aware of what you're doing. Because I suddenly remembered, I've said you couldn't set a story in Auschwitz, but I do have written a story that's coming out this year that hasn't been announced yet, which does lightly touch on what's going to happen in Germany. It's set in 1930s Germany, and it kind of touches on where it's going without specifically kind of referencing it too hard. It makes me think, you know what, if you wanted to tell a story about some of these things, you probably could. But at the same time, you'd have to be very aware of what you're doing, very careful. Potentially, I wouldn't necessarily suggest an Auschwitz one per se, but you'd have to have a certain degree of awareness of where it ends and an honesty and a truth, and maybe have it written by someone Jewish if you were going to do that.
Yeah, well, yeah, obviously.
Where it actually feels a little bit truthful. I mean, yeah, because I remember, just to give you kind of an example of what you hopefully kind of work, I remember that I wrote a story called Their Finest Hour, which was about the Polish fighter pilots in World War II, Churchill in it. And I was very keen that the end of it has one of them just killed randomly, because I felt that you can't just get away with them having shenanigans for an hour and then go, hey, it's war, it's all fun. No, one of them's dead, completely separate reasons, just gets gunned down accidentally the next day or something like that. And so it's things like that which I think you need to kind of be aware of.
I think as long as the story is truthful to the idea and that it is respectful, I think you could. I mean, yeah, how many times has Doctor Who done Jack the Ripper, or has
surprisingly few, I think, weirdly enough, when I think about it.
But that kind of milieu, so to speak. So yes, right. So we're getting towards the end of this now, John, and it's been amazing. It's been brilliant. I've really enjoyed every second of it. As is traditional on these sledgehammers, we finish on 2 questions. The first question is, what's the best bit of writing advice you've ever been given?
Okay. Oddly enough, I think it's probably read.
Yeah.
Read everything. I mean, not necessarily reading. I mean, watch things, follow things. There's a glorious quote. I think it's Stephen Moffat talks about how if you're writing something, you've seen enough film, you've seen enough TV, you've read enough books that you know what a well-told story feels like and what its shape is. How do you make what you're writing feel like that? You cannot come up with stories and tell decent stories unless you experience stories.
Right.
So I'm always reading, I'm always watching dramas and films kind of obsessively. I've started doing this thing for about 6 years now. I realized ages ago that I wasn't reading anywhere near as much as I wanted to. I was realizing I was only reading on trains. Because I worked from home, I wasn't taking trains that often. And then when I got on trains, I'd end up going, it's been a while since I've read this, a bit hard to get back into it. I'll just play some Candy Crush. So I ended up never reading anything. And then so I started doing what I call my imaginary commute, where I sit down for 30 minutes and read a book, unless I was actually taking a train, in which case I'd just use that time for that. Last year, it developed into an hour and reading 2 at a time. And I feel that this is, when I've been pushed to a deadline, it's particularly over the last year where we've had a lot of things, we go, oh God, we need this by whenever. I've still made that time. I would rather spend an extra day working on a script, give up what part of my weekend and not give up that hour a morning of reading other fiction, because I think that is important processing time. I
think you're absolutely right. I made a virtue of it because I forced myself to do some more reading. But there was a year, maybe about 5 years ago, where, like Garth Marenghi, I wrote more books than I read in the year. I did. Yeah. I did. I wrote 5-6 books in the year and only read about 3. So I tried to reverse that. And so, reading is vitally important, as well as it's also watching and things.
Yeah, I'd suggest as wide a variety as possible. Also some shit ones.
Yes.
Because you get more ideas and go, well, why didn't this work? And so this is what they should have done instead is quite exciting. Or why don't I like this? Yes. What do I think is wrong? Clues you into what to do that's right.
Terrific. And our last question is, because one of the things I'm hoping for with these podcasts is they're going to go to people who listen to them who want to write their own stuff, that it will encourage them to write their own stuff, to give some pointers and some insight.
Oh, absolutely.
What advice do you give to other writers?
I always give the same 2 pieces of advice. The ones I start off with, I've given a couple, like the write a story about an elephant is a good one. And I will always preface this by saying these sound trite, these sound inane, but they are genuinely, I think, the most important things. And there are 2 pieces of advice. Point number 1, start it.
Yep.
Just start. Keep going. The blank page is terrifying. The moment you've got a blank page, where it could be anything, just dive in with that. Then once you've started, you can keep going and you've got something you can develop and build. Second one, you can probably guess, is finish it.
Finish it, absolutely.
Because until you've finished it, you've got nothing. The amount of ideas we've got that just sit there undone, incomplete. And also, I mean, this is sort of one that's kind of related, that'll tie into this a bit. The amount of times, because you will look at a finished thing as well, and you'll think, well, this is rubbish. Given what I said about Stephen Moffat compared to, you'll say, well, why is this not good? That every single thing you see, you read, whatever, is not the first draft.
Absolutely.
It's gone through other people. It's gone through editors. It's gone through, actors, whatever. So never compare your first pass on something. Yes, you know what? Your first pass will be shit. Pretty much guaranteed. If you were starting writing now, you've started it, you finished it, you look at it, well, that's rubbish. Go and write something else.
Yeah.
So you'll have learnt so much from that, or rewrite what you've got.
Absolutely.
But everybody's first draft ever is shit.
Yes, absolutely. And on that note, on that bombshell, John Dorney, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
No, absolutely, mate. It's been great. I've learnt loads, as always, with these things, but it's been a particular pleasure talking to somebody who wrote one of my favourite Doctor Who stories of all time. So, as I can't, unless I have a séance, can't speak to Robert Holmes, you'll do.
Well, that'll do. In the absence...
You'll do. Brilliant, mate. Thank you so much.
You'll do. That's my note. That's my CV. You'll just about do.
You'll do. All right. You take care, and thank you again.
Take care, mate. My pleasure. It's been a delight. Thank you for having me.
You take care. Bye-bye. And my immense thanks this week go to John for that turn around the Ark in space and his writing process for audio. I hope you found it as chock full of quality stuff as I did. Thanks also to Martin Holmes for his help in the snipping and splicing departments. And Sledgehammer will be back next week on your podcast platform of choice, where I'll be talking to another writer about their work. And trust me, next week's has already fallen through a hole in time directly into my ears. And it's another corker.